Hey there, this is Vancy the Fancy Van, and I'm here to tell you about my 2 years as a solo female traveler in this van. In this video, I'm going to tell you about my top 3 concerns that I had as a solo female traveler and how I addressed them. I got into van life during COVID. I was single and my social life had changed a lot during COVID. People had moved away, people had grown apart. I was really kind of starting over socially. There wasn't anything to hold me in the place where I was living at the time. And I was thinking seriously about moving, but I wasn't sure where. I had a couple places in mind and they were all pretty far away and closer to family. And so I wanted to kind of test those places out. I wanted also the freedom to travel. I have a mode of employment that allows me to work remote. And so I was able to work from anywhere, and I wanted to start using that and take advantage of that so I could get around and see the country and work anywhere, take my life on the road and work anywhere while traveling and discovering new places and exploring some of the places that I thought I might want to put down roots for more long-term stationary household. So my van life dream was born, and I decided to have a van built custom. And I wanted a van that would allow me to live in the van full time without feeling cramped or cluttered. So it needed to be spacious, and I needed a van that would allow me to work remote and do that comfortably without ending up with hip or neck or back pain. I wanted a van that would allow me to cook easily so I could eat healthy no matter where I went. And I wanted a van that would allow me to explore different areas where I might put down roots. And it had to be a stealth van because I wanted to live in it full time and to have the security, privacy, safety of a discreet van that did not look like anyone was living in it. So I could park anywhere and feel safe and feel like I had privacy and not feel concerned about getting night knocks and things like that. So I went all in and I found the right builder and sold most of my stuff, put the rest in storage, everything that I wanted to keep, and lived on the road for 2 years as a solo female traveler. There were some periods where I stayed, with friends, family, and also at a meditation center during that period. But mostly I was living full-time in the van for 2 years and traveling up and down both coasts and across the country. It was a real adventure, and I enjoyed being able to wander as I pleased, being able to park overnight anywhere that a car could park as long as I only stayed for one night. And I pretty much lived in a different place every day. I got to explore all of my favorite cities, go to some national parks, and pretty much just see all kinds of different places across the country. And eventually I found a place where I wanted to stay long term, and I found a new love, and now I'm putting down roots and living in a house again and selling my van. But I wanted to share a little bit about my experience for other people, and in particular other women who are interested in being full-time van lifers. So my main concern when I was exploring the idea of van life was actually not safety or night knocks, but it was actually community. How am I going to get my social needs met while I'm not staying in one place, and it can be difficult to form community when you're moving around a lot. It can be difficult to form meaningful connections if you're not seeing people consistently. So that was actually my main concern, is how am I going to, I'm a very social person, how am I going to get my social needs fulfilled while traveling? Shortly after I began sitting with this question of how am I going to get my needs for community met while living in a van and traveling, I encountered an organization called KIBO at the time. Now I believe it's called KIFT, K-I-F-T, KIFT. And they are all about creating community for van lifers. So I took that as a sign that there are ways that I can make this happen. And I kind of just took it on faith. And I did explore KIBO at the time, and go to some events. I did meet up with a group of people in Southern California for a short event. I didn't personally find my tribe, I'd say, with that organization, but I thought there were some really cool people, and so that's a resource. And I'm sure there are many other resources like it that provide opportunities for van lifers and other travelers to connect and meet up. I know there's a bunch of websites for this purpose to network with other travelers. I didn't end up finding that I used that much personally, because what I ended up doing was just favoring a route where there were people who I knew and could visit. And so I tended to just follow the trajectory that balanced what are the places that I want to go, what are the places I want to visit, national parks I want to see, cities I want to check out, that kind of thing. But also, where are there people along the way that I know, and how can I plan my route around visiting friends and family who I have across the country, which is lovely anyways. And also, I found it was really very nourishing to actually just go out to lunch or go out to dinner by myself and be around people, or go to a cafe for the day. This is a trick that I learned when I first became single, is just to take myself out and just be around people. And there often isn't that much interaction, but there's something about just being out among people that helps with feeling a sense of connectedness to other people. Oh, and of course, phone calls, just making a point of scheduling phone calls with friends and family while you're away and keeping in touch in that way. And so those are the ways that I met my needs for community and social connection while traveling. My second concern as a solo female traveler was safety, and I did take that into account when I designed the van with my builder, and I thought about that in terms of the kind of van I wanted. And that was one of the reasons why I chose not to have any windows in the cab. I did put 2 sunroofs in the ceiling, and of course there's windows in the front of the vehicle, but no windows in the rear part. And I wanted that for privacy, security, sound insulation, heat insulation. There's quite a lot of advantages of not having windows versus the disadvantages of having them. The fear, of course, is that someone is going to break into your van while you're sleeping. And so windows add additional entry points that are a risk for that. I think that it is, of course, it's unlikely that anyone's going to break into your van. But as a solo female traveler, we think of these things. And so I did think of that. And so I was happy with the choice to not put any windows along the rear of the vehicle, other than the 2 sunroofs, which were an absolute lifesaver because they gave me natural light with complete privacy and security. And another thing is that if you're ever not in a stealth situation, you can just open the doors. You just open that big, beautiful back door and this big, beautiful side door, and then you've got 2 giant windows. When you're in stealth, the windows are covered anyways, and when you're not in stealth, you don't need the windows because you just open the doors. So I decided and felt really good about not getting windows, and that meant that if I was alone at night, which most of the time I was alone because I was a solo female traveler, I was not so worried about break-ins, and I knew that I only had to really think about the front of the vehicle as the only entry point, and I was in the back of the vehicle in this bed, and by the time anyone could get to me, I would be awake with my stun gun in hand and ready to defend myself. Fortunately, I never had anything even close to a fearful situation while I was traveling. And I also I had these 2 sunroofs, which, as I said, were a game changer for natural light, and those are entry points as well. But if anyone was climbing on top of the van, I would have felt them and heard them. So that all made me feel pretty safe. Another thing is that you can add, I did not choose to do this, but you can add a break-resistant sealant to the cab windows so that it would take quite a few whacks with whatever, implement to get through the windows, which would wake you up in the situation of a break-in. So that's another thing that people who are concerned about security can look into. But my main safety measure was really just to be very careful about where I parked. And so for me, that meant that I was never parking places where there weren't people around. For me, I was mainly parking in urban stealth situations. And so it really didn't feel that different from being in one of the houses that I was parked next to versus being in, my little metal box. Either way, I was surrounded by my short-term neighbors, and, in the unlikely event of an attack, then people would hear me. And so there were always people around. I always put myself in situations where there were people around. The exception to that would be campsites, but I would choose campsites that had people around. And I didn't really do boondocking by myself. So if I was going to be doing a situation where I was in a more remote place, out in the woods somewhere, I would make sure that I had someone with me. I would plan a travel partner, call a friend up and coordinate to go visit thus and such a national monument together, or go boondocking in this woods together. Or there were a few occasions where I had a nice boy to come with me. And so I chose to go to those more remote places and those more isolated sleeping situations when I was not alone. And that helped me feel safer. But otherwise, overnight, I stuck with places that had people around. And so I didn't really feel different than, like I said, if I was in one of those houses that I was parked next to. It felt as secure as if I was in that apartment that I was parked next to. So that felt pretty good for me. And another thing is this is a giant metal box, right? It's like a little fortress. So it really did feel pretty secure to me. Made sure to lock the doors every night and had my stun gun. I was aware of other items in the vehicle that could be used as a weapon if I needed to. But it's also really important to remember that the overwhelming majority of people not only are not trying to hurt you, but would protect you. That gives me heart. And it's just nice to remember that not only are most people not out to get you, most people would actively take measure, either to physically intervene or to call the police or whatever the case may be. There's a lot of people who are looking out for you, if they're around, if there's people around. And my third concern that I had as I was venturing into being a solo female traveler was stealth and how I could park overnight anywhere a car could park without getting those knocks from the neighbors or from the police, being asked to move. That's stressful, even if there's no real consequences, which sometimes there are, right? Sometimes you get ticketed. I mean, that can happen. I've heard of that happening. And even if there are no consequences other than please move, it can be very stressful, and those interactions can sometimes be angry and aggressive. I had one negative experience with being asked to move, and that was one time when I was being kind of obvious, and I was in the kind of neighborhood where there would be van people. And so I think that made me think that it was cool. I could kind of let my guard down and be a little bit less discreet. I was cooking in the van with music playing and lights on at 9 p.m., 9:30 p.m. And someone came along and knocked and said, "Hey, the kids are going down. It's time for you to go." My guess is that they had had previous interactions with some other van, and they were probably surprised when they saw me, tiny 5'0" female driving away. I don't think I was the threatening, scary person they expected when they were chasing me out of their neighborhood with torches and pitchforks. But that was a stressful encounter for me because, they were rude, they were aggro, their tone was very aggressive. And I left, and that was that. But it was stressful, and so those experiences want to be avoided. Fortunately, that only happened for me once. And that was the only time. And as I said, it was the time that I was being very indiscreet. I was making noise. I had lights on, and I was active in the van at bedtime. And generally, the rule of stealth is that you go park the van where you're going to park overnight at bedtime, and then you just go to bed, and you're not there doing things in the van that draws attention to the van, draws attention to you, makes people wonder what's going on in that van, and is it a threat to me? Because I intended to do urban stealth parking, I made it a point to choose carefully an appearance to the outside of the van that did not give away that anyone was living in it. That meant, once again, choosing no windows in the body of the vehicle and putting very little on the outside. So, for example, no awning. I chose not to get a roof rack. I did put an air conditioner in the ceiling and some sort of low profile sunroofs and flares. You can see the flare, that's the cutout that's on either edge of the bed that adds a little extra length to the bed. And they do add a little pop out to the outside, although it's really quite subtle. Now, it's much more likely that people who are in the know about van life will see things like flares, an air conditioner, or other structures on the top of the van and think that that is maybe a conversion van, but most people are still not in the know. And most people just don't have that on their radar. And they're not paying attention anyways, and they're too busy to care. So effectively, these subtle features that I did include in my van, the air conditioner, the two low-profile sunroofs, and the pop-outs, they never caused my stealth to be compromised. My van looks very much on the outside like a high-end work van. So it's just a plain white van. There's very minimal modifications to the exterior, and I have a curtain between the cab and the interior. So my lived experience is that those structures were not sufficient to set off a lot of alarms, because the only time that anyone ever bothered me was the one time that I was being indiscreet. And I never stuck around long enough for people to really think much about it anyways. Most of the time I was, parking at night, gone in the morning, and then off doing whatever I was doing during the day. So while some of these features might make people who are in the know question whether or not this is a conversion van. Most people are still not in the know, and most of the people who are in the know are supportive of van life. Like, that's why they know about it. And the few people who aren't, they're not going to bother you, generally speaking, if you don't stick around and don't be obvious. There are also some places where you just shouldn't park your van overnight because there are too many unhappy neighbors who are in the know. And I think that's the kind of neighborhood that I was in at the time, which was Dolores Park in San Francisco, which is a neighborhood where, you know, people go to the park and they party. And, you know, there's probably quite a lot of van lifers that try to spend a little time there. And I was one of them. And I think that, you know, a piece of it really is that some neighborhoods are just not going to be friendly to vans because there have been too many vans there. And I've heard of other parts of, you know, places in LA that are kind of like that. Overall, stealth parking worked great for me. As I said, I only had that one negative encounter. I do love cities. I love city life. I love visiting all different cities. And so I was very happy to spend a lot of time in cities and to bounce around. And often I had different people who I was visiting in these cities. And sometimes I would stay longer if I had a driveway to park in, but generally I just kind of kept on the move, which worked well for my van anyways, because my van has a system, an electrical system that is charged by driving. So by just driving like 15-20 minutes a day in moderate weather, which is to say I wasn't running the AC all the time and draining the battery that way, I could have all of my electrical needs, including working on my laptop using the laptop monitor that I have here, and doing my cooking, and, you know, having my light, my refrigerator, and all I needed was 15-20 minutes of drive time daily to keep those electrical needs met. So that worked out great. This van is built to move, so it works well for that kind of stealth bouncing around. A good way that I would often use to find places to park in unfamiliar cities is that I would go into Google Maps, I would zoom in until I could see what were the yellow zones, which were generally the places that had a lot of congestion, and those were places with a lot of restaurants and, you know, shops and things like that, little boutique shops. And those neighborhoods I found were very good for parking. You're less likely to have vigilant neighbors in those areas. They're used to cars coming and going. Those are also the kinds of neighborhoods that I really loved to visit, the places with the cute shops and the nice restaurants and, you know, the cute parts of town. So I would find those neighborhoods that way. There's plenty of cars, you can easily blend in, but there's still enough parking spaces available that you can find one. And usually overnight parking, not for all of them, but for many of them, overnight parking is an option. So often I would go visit these cute little shopping and restaurant districts. I would poke around the shops, get a nice dinner and a cocktail, and then just walk out the door, go to bed in my van. It was really nice. Another parking option that I made a lot of use of is Planet Fitness. Planet Fitness is very popular among van lifers and nomads for a reason. It's really very affordable, and they're everywhere. And I would often go park overnight at the 24-hour Planet Fitnesses. There are quite a lot of those, and they're in almost every city. Often I would go park overnight at these 24-hour Planet Fitnesses, and then in the morning I would go to the gym, which we should all have a fitness routine anyways, right? That's a twofer, right? Now I've got my parking, I've got my workout, and then I take my shower. So that's three birds, one stone. Really good. So I loved parking at Planet Fitness when there was one around, and often there was. Another parking option that you hear a lot about for travel in van life and RVs and things is Walmarts. I didn't really find them very useful though. Maybe it's because I was mostly I was up along the coasts where these are areas that are more populated, but I found that many of the Walmarts, at least according to their official policy, did not allow overnight parking. There's a website, I believe it's rvparky.com. It's a great resource that tells you what are some places where you can park overnight. There are Walmarts included on the list, but then they will also say, you know, whether somebody within the past year or two tried to stay there and was told that they couldn't. Generally, the protocol is that you should call and ask, but many of these places, many of the Walmarts I found, if you call and ask, will say no, you can't park here overnight. As I mentioned, that might be because I was generally along the coast where areas are more congested. It may be that in the giant expanse of the country that's between the coast, there are plenty of Walmarts that do officially allow overnight parking. I just generally wasn't there. I was up and down one coast, and then I was mostly along the south, and then I was up and down the other coast. You know, there are giant chunks of the country that I didn't see on this particular travel phase that might have plenty of Walmarts available for parking. RV Parky is a good resource for that, but I personally did not make much use of Walmarts. Many of them, as I said, you could call and they would say no. And it might be that unofficially, maybe it wasn't enforced, but I never tried to park overnight at a Walmart where you weren't officially allowed, because once again, that was a situation where I would be alone. And those were very deserted parking lots, and I didn't feel safe putting myself in those kinds of isolated situations as a solo female traveler. Another place that I would often park, especially if I was in more sparse areas where you couldn't really blend into a neighborhood. For example, there are some areas that they're not urban enough that your vehicle would not be noticed. So, for example, you couldn't park in a neighborhood where there aren't enough cars that you would just blend into the other cars. Or at least I never tried, because I felt like it would be obvious. You know, there's like two neighbors and they could easily call and say, "Hey, Flo, is that van yours?" And you know, whereas if you're in more populated areas, then it could be any of these neighbors' vehicle or a work vehicle for any of these houses, and it's, you know, it's less likely that people would take the time to do the detective work of who does this van belong to, why is it here, and is it a threat, right? So in places that were a little more sparse, where you couldn't just park on the side of the road by houses, I would often park at a hotel. I did that a number of times. It wasn't the main thing that I did. The main thing I did was urban stealth parking in more populated areas with lots of vehicles that you could blend into. But I did occasionally park in hotels. I never got a knock. The assumption is that, you know, they probably assume that this vehicle, even if they think it is a conversion van, they probably assume that it belongs to a person who's staying in the hotel. So as long as you're not staying more than one night, and as long as you take off in the morning, they're not going to bother you. So those were my top 3 concerns that I had as a solo female traveler starting out on van life: community, safety, and stealth. And those are the ways that I addressed them. I had a beautiful 2 years living full-time in Vancy, the fancy van, and I hope that you found this video useful. Take care.